Welcome to this video in which we are going to analyze some of the movements of the technique of Agustín Castellón Campos, aka Sabicas. Now, I'll just say a couple of things about Sabicas before we dive into the video here. And the first thing is, all the great flamenco players mention him as being a huge part of the flamenco guitar culture. Somebody that they grew up idolizing, somebody that they wanted to learn from, and just an indispensable part of what they understand about flamenco. The second thing is that Sabicas was, I'm pretty sure he was my teacher's #1 favorite guitarist of all time. There were a few guys that he put at the top, but I think his #1 favorite was Sabicas. And you know my teacher, his name was Robert Guthrie, and we've looked at him, some of the movements of his technique on this series before, so you know him well. And I remember early on in my lessons with him mentioning Sabicas. And I said something like, "Who?" And he said, "You don't know Sabicas?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Oh, okay." So we went over to the computer to look at some YouTube videos, which was pretty much the only thing that I think he thought the computer was good for, was looking up guitarists on YouTube. So he pulled up some videos and we were watching some of the same footage that you're seeing now. And he told me to really focus on Sabicas' right hand. And he said, "Look at this right hand. Look at the way that it works. Look at all the things that it can do. And look how amazingly naturally relaxed that it is." And he said, "This is how you want to play with the right hand." So he said, absorb as much of this as you possibly can, because this is basically the way to do everything. In my preparation for this video, as I'm listening to Sabicas and I'm hearing the amazing sound that he gets, you know, he had a depth and just a live quality to all of his sounds. And I'm watching him in action, and I'm looking at his right hand and saying, it's just free as a bird. It's as strong and as accurate and as powerful as can be. And it just has absolutely no restrictions. There's an element of flow and smoothness here to his sound and his technique that I really think he achieved like no one else. And then you listen also to the response that he was getting from his guitar, which I think also says a whole lot about the player. You know, how happy is your guitar as you're doing all these things to it? Is it holding on for dear life? Or is it just roaring with joy because it really likes how you're treating it, okay? I think Sabicas really stands alone. And I don't really play flamenco music. I'm a great appreciator of it. It's one of my favorite forms of art that exist. But these qualities, you know, having a sound with life, having the natural flowing technique, and just the aural results that you get from being extremely relaxed and moving very natural, these things can help any fingerstyle guitarist. They are great qualities, and Sabicas just had them in spades. And we've talked about other guitarists in terms of being stoic, and I'll just mention this briefly. You know, Sabicas might win the all-time Stoicism Award because he's about as stoic as you can get, but the difference between him and another guitarist that may be equally, you know, expressionless with the face, basically zero body movement or anything like that, is that there is a fireworks show going off in his hands. That's the difference. He is just as stoic as some other people that we've looked at, and that seems like that was just his approach. You know, if you look at his face, he has the same expression on his face that like some of us might have if we're sitting there watching TV. Almost as if this was the most mundane thing to him in the world. And yet, there are fireballs shooting out from each of his hands with the amazing things that he's doing with his technique. So I want to start out as we delve into looking at his sitting position. So what we see here is pretty much like traditionally classical, you know, is what it makes me think of. So he would use a footstool under his left foot, and the right foot would be on the floor. Something to note about the footstool is it looks like he used a very high footstool, especially in some shots. It just looks extremely up there. I can almost imagine him, going to some store and trying out all their footstools to see which one with the highest, and then that was the one that he bought. The guitar doesn't really sit, I would say, traditionally classical. He does more of a flamenco thing with it. Instead of the guitar resting on the leg, kind of in the crook, where the guitar bends up, he's got the upper bout resting on his left leg. And then the lower bout looks like it's resting on his right leg. So he's actually using both legs to support it. And then the last thing I'll say about his sitting position is I found this really interesting moment. Sometimes I find these little things and I don't really know if they mean anything. All I know is that there's a great player and this is what they're doing. So I just like to point them out and wonder, what could this possibly do for them? Maybe nothing, but maybe something pretty important. So I ran across this one video here, and as always I have all the videos linked in the description for you to find there. But I ran across this video and I started to watch it and I thought, well, I can't really use this, the audio is not great, the video is not great. But I kind of skimmed through it and I noticed there's some pretty good shots of his sitting position. You can see his feet, right? But then I noticed something strange as he's playing. His right foot that's on the floor is really pointed. Like his toe is touching the ground and then that's it. The heel of that foot is in the air. So I thought, interesting, and he's sitting on a wooden chair. It's definitely not adjustable or anything like that. So I thought, well, maybe the chair was a little bit too tall and so he had to point his foot. But then as I skimmed throughout the video, I noticed there were points where his right foot wasn't as pointed. It doesn't look like his heel is all the way to the ground, but it's much closer. So at this moment, he's tuning. He's in between pieces and he's tuning. So I thought, oh, interesting, okay. So he's gonna relax when he's not playing. So then he starts the next piece. He starts the piece and then he gives like the compás, right? The beat pattern in which, you're probably gonna strum a lot of chords. And as he plays that passage, his foot remains in that state, not pointed. Then when he started the first falsetta, he points his foot. So I can't really imagine what that might have done for him, and I don't know if that was conscious or unconscious. But it is a definite change that happens at certain points throughout the concert. So here I want to look at some of his general free stroke technique. Of course, this is very important for pretty much any type of fingerstyle guitarist. You're going to be using this technique all the time. It's a big part of your sound. And Sabicas had amazing tone. So I wanted to look at some of the mechanisms that make that happen. And the first thing I noticed here, we have him playing like some arpeggiated passages. So this will be very common movements that he'll use. And, I've never had like a flamenco lesson really. My teacher taught me some of the strengths that flamenco guitarists use that other people can also incorporate. So I don't know if this is actually taught. In classical, what's really taught is you move from the big joint, right? Because a lot of times when people start out, they're pulling the strings a lot, they're getting very snappy sounds. So you want to teach them, drive that stroke from the big joint and kind of focus on moving from there, okay? But what we've seen over and over in this series is the pivotal role that the middle joint plays. And that is definitely what I see here in Sabicas' free stroke technique. So you can see here he's doing AMI arpeggio, so it's in that sequence. As he makes the stroke, the middle joints go kind of like up and out. So although the big joints certainly do play a role, they're also moving. The middle joints kind of go up, and it causes the finger to, it looks like to me, kind of pull the string up a certain degree. Here's another example in which he's doing like a big arpeggiated chord. So this time he's going from thumb through AMI. So he's going the opposite direction. But I think you can see it even more. You see a pretty big curling of the finger after the stroke, especially the eye finger. And then you see that middle joint just jutting out kind of away from the palm. So very involved in the stroke. And you can see as he goes from finger to finger, each middle joint doing a similar motion, kind of shooting out from the hand to make that stroke. And in these arpeggiated passages, his tip joints look pretty firm. I mean, maybe it's impossible to tell, what they felt like in terms of how much give they had. And I know people can be really different in this area, just genetically. But when you watch it slow and you see his follow through, you see that tip joint bent. So it looks like he kept them, pretty firm, because that's the way that they ended up at the end of the stroke. But in these passages here, he's playing chords, like block chords, PIMA chords. And he does stuff a little bit differently. So these are also still free stroke. But in these chords, you don't see the middle joints jumping out from the hand in quite the same way. Maybe just a tad, but mainly it looks like they're going back, and then the fingers are going back in that direction more, kind of towards the palm more. And then when you watch these strokes in action, it looks like to me you can see his tip joints flexing. There's just this very brief moment. So all these chords are either blocked chords or they are swiftly arpeggiated chords. Basically still one event. And I feel like you can just barely see there's a moment where those tip joints flex as he makes the stroke to play these chords. And I think you can see it, by slowing it down and isolating this one tiny little moment. But I think also just in the follow through of the strokes, when you watch it in motion, it's a different looking follow through. The tip joints, when they bend slightly after the stroke, it just gives a different kind of look, where you can just barely see that flexed shape kind of bounding off the strings a little bit, instead of moving through it more with the more stiff tip joint. Now, of course, with somebody like Sabicas, I want to look at their picado technique, because a great picado sound is still one of my very favorite sounds in music. And I can't really think of another sound that sounds like it. It is just really, really unique. Blows my mind every single time. Sabicas utilized what I call long finger scales. So when he switched to his picado technique, he kept a tall wrist. He didn't flatten out his wrist and then kind of make the fingers shorter. He kept a pretty tall wrist, and then definitely utilized, looks like heavily utilized, the big joint in the picado stroke, which kind of just gives the appearance kind of a longer finger. Like you're utilizing the whole finger more and not kind of cramping it into a particular position. So, of course, Sabicas' go-to technique, which is almost exclusively what I saw him use. There's one exception that I'll get to in a minute. But he used the I am apoyando alternating technique. And there's a couple of things about it that I'd like to point out. One is he utilizes something that I kind of call the A finger tuck. And my teacher was big on this. I wonder where he got it from. So this is a good shot. He plays this really cool picado run where it starts with two alternating E's, or I guess maybe they're F sharps. He's got a capo on here. And it's a cool string crossing thing. If you're going to figure this out, be careful, because I liked it so much I had to figure it out. But the audio is a little bit off. So you may think, I first found it occurring in this kind of natural way. But then I rechecked the video and I thought, is it like upside down from what I thought? But be careful, the audio is a little bit off, and if you think you know how this goes, you probably do. But just don't let that trip you up, because it tripped me up. It's a very neat line. I love the way how he kind of arranges it on the guitar. I think it's great for practice. I practiced it a whole lot yesterday, and today my hand is sore. So, but what we get a really good shot of here is the A finger tuck. And what's cool about this, and man, hats off to this cameraman, because perfect shot at the perfect time for what he's doing here. He starts out slowly, and then he gradually increases speed. So you can see that he just rests his thumb on the 6th string as he's playing the upper string, right? And then if you watch as he increases speed, if you look in the space between his thumb and fingers, you can see there's his A finger. And that's why I call it the A finger tuck. Now, many people, when they play fast scales, their A finger goes the other direction. It sticks out. Maybe their pinky sticks out. And the A finger kind of tremors along with the M finger. But he does something very different. And you can see, because I'm trying to pause on shots here, where you can see it being pretty curled into his hand. In fact, I mean, he could probably pluck a string with it, it looks like, if he wanted. So that's very interesting, I think. And this is extremely consistent throughout with his Picado technique. Something else that I want to mention that, I definitely can't explain is the kind of torque that he gets. So in this clip here, okay, he's resting the thumb on the 6th string, and you can see the 6th string moving, right? Until it has to come off the strings because he's descending. But I'm trying to find from which point does he get his torque, which is extremely powerful. So it's coming from somewhere. And what I notice in his technique is his I finger moves a lot. Like, it really does. I'm not saying it moves too much. Just in comparison to his M finger hardly moves. When he really kicks it into gear. But the I finger, it just has this almost wave about it that it does. It has a whole lot more movement. And I do see some kind of wiggle in his hand, like some kind of back and forth type of motion. And back to this great shot here, we can really see it, and then this is just so cool because you can see it as he speeds up. So look at his thumb here. Like, look at his thumb, like kind of where it starts to go into the wrist, in that area. So as he does the strokes, he starts to wiggle, and then as he increases speed, he wiggles more and 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 faster and faster. And then you really start to see that go. So I can't really tell where the torque is coming from. The thumb is just also feeling that. You can also see the 6th string really moving. In this shot from the front, which is usually not my favorite shot, but in trying to figure out where he gets this torque from, I think this is a pretty good way to see it. So this is actually that same alternating passage that starts on the unison notes, or something very similar. I think he plays it a little bit differently. But you can see as he starts slowly and then builds speed, his wrist just kind of tremor back and forth. Another thing that we can see here in this shot, economy of movement is of course a big thing when you're talking about being efficient. So if you want to play fast, something like that, yeah, you got to move efficiently. Okay, you can't be wasting all kind of movement. But I just think this is a subject that's not near as straightforward as it may seem. So what looks like to me is happening here is this is a clip where he's starting slowly and then speeding up. It looks like to me as he speeds up, his I finger moves more. Not like 2 inches more, but definitely more. As he's starting slowly, it's this tiny little movement, and then he starts to execute this kind of throwing out of the finger kind of thing where it kind of comes from a distance. So this really has me thinking economy of movement, sure, but maybe it doesn't always work the way that you think it does. Maybe it's a little bit more of a gray area than it seems. And then I did want to point out the one instance that I could find where it looked like he was utilizing something besides exclusive IM alternation for a scale. So when I first saw this, I thought maybe it was an AMI scale because the hand just looked different. And it's a triplet scale. This is his Sabicas. I hope I'm saying that right. This is one of my favorite pieces of his. It's in a low D tuning. It's really like a harmonic theme and variations type piece. Kind of really classically influenced, if you ask me. But he just does a ton of different stuff, and I just love the character of the piece. It's absolutely phenomenal, and I love the way that he plays it. And it has these really rhythmic, super happy sounding scale runs in it. So because his hand just looked different when he did these runs, I thought, oh, it's a group of three, he must be doing AMI. So I thought, oh, I'll point that out, that'll be neat. But then I took a closer look and I thought, I don't think it's AMI. I think he's doing something different. So what I think he's doing here is still MI alternation, but for some of the string crossings, when he goes from string to string, he does the old I drag trick. Instead of doing a string crossing with the other finger, he goes I from string to string. So what I hear when he plays the scale, or what I see what it looks like, is da 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 I drag da 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 I drag da I drag da. That's what it looks like to me. Which, that is really just tricky. You know, it's funny because I have some students that play scales like this, and I try hard to get them to not play scales like this. I want them to learn how consistent and reliable an alternating IM technique can be. But sometimes before people can learn that, they end up doing this type of thing. But I think it's just such an interesting choice. And this scale is at a slower tempo, especially for somebody like this. So speed is definitely not an issue. It certainly makes me wonder why he chose this technique in this particular spot. Maybe he just thought it was interesting and wanted to throw it in. But when I found that, I just thought that was really cool. Definitely very tricky, right? Quite virtuosic, because the scale is just as even as can be. So whether he's doing alternation or two strokes in a row with the same finger, I wouldn't be able to tell listening to it because it just sounds absolutely even. So amazing utilization of this really quite tricky technique. Now I want to switch to the fretboard hand for a couple of things. So the first thing I want to mention is what I call the fourth finger flagpole. Okay, so I've learned that something that I should always notice about somebody when they play is what do they do with the fourth finger on their fretboard hand? So for many people, the answer will be, well, they do what they do with all their other fingers. You know, it basically looks the same and acts the same. It's just shaped a little bit differently because it's the fourth finger, okay? But for some people, and for Sabicas, the answer is they do something pretty darn different. They pretty much utilize the finger differently, and in many instances, it looks very different and it works very differently than all the other fingers. So in this instance, the way that Sabicas uses his fourth finger, I call it the flagpole, because a lot of times it will just stick straight up in the air. In this clip here, he will be holding a chord in which he doesn't need the fourth finger, and his fourth finger is just sticking straight up like a flagpole. And this really does make me wonder if it's a balance thing, you know? Like some people will eat a taco and they'll stick their pinky up in the air when they eat the taco. You know, why is that? Or, you know, I don't drink tea. I don't really eat tacos either. But I don't drink tea, but some people when they drink tea, They stick their pinky in the air. How come? I don't know. Is it a balance thing? There's got to be some kind of reason here. But he will definitely do that from time to time. When he needs to use the fourth finger, I mean, it's always right where it needs to be. And sometimes it will even be nice and curled, you know, quote unquote, well behaved. But then when it's not in use, it's likely to just stick straight up in the air until he's ready to use it again. And in some instances, like we see here, we can really see the different type of motion that it has. And this certainly reminds me of instances that we've seen before. So when he's using it like this, you can see it kind of flapping about. And the flapping motion, it really lets you see how it's working, which is that if the finger were to be remaining curled and then just lifting and placing from the big joint, you wouldn't really see much movement. You would just see just a slight lifting. It's kind of even hard to visually recognize. But what you see going on here is the opening up from the finger of the middle joint as well. And that's what gives you the flapping type of thing, that kind of look. So the middle joint is very involved in putting the finger down. It closes the finger so that it can find where it needs to go, but then taking the finger off the string, it opens up the finger and makes it flap out in that direction. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in terms of his fretboard hand technique, I think is really pretty strange. And this has to do with his fretboard hand thumb. So we've seen people do different things with their thumb, right? Some people keep it nice and flat, where that tip joint of the thumb always remains straight. Some people, you know, grip with the tip joint, they're bending it. Some people stick their thumb up over the neck. And I saw this in a few shots, but this is the shot where I think you can really see it the best. So Sabicas has something different going on here, and I've never seen this before. So when he's in a position, it looks like typically his thumb will be flat. So he's not tensing with that tip joint thumb, right? Which many people will tell you not to do. But, you know, a lot of people do it. But then you look and you see his tip joint flex. And it actually kind of pushes the thumb off the neck. And when that happens, it happens when he shifts. And I have never noticed this before. So his thumb is flat until he needs to shift. And then right before he shifts, he flexes the tip joint and you can see the joint sticking out. And then he moves, and then when he replaces his thumb, now it's back to being flat. This is really quite fascinating to me, and I think it's really strange. This is maybe one of the strangest things that I've ever seen. He somehow uses the tip joint of his thumb to maybe like jump off the neck so that he can get out of one position and then get to another. But while he's in the position, it looks like, for the most part, his thumb remains straight. So we've certainly seen people flexing the tip joint of their thumb and using it in some pretty weird ways, but never like this, where it's used not to hold a position or to give more strength or more pressure in a certain position, but to shift, to get out of a position and to kind of push the thumb away from the neck in order to execute the shift. So from here on out, I just wanted to highlight some of the different techniques that Sabicas would use. You know, in a lot of guitarists, when I watch them play and you see the finger combinations that they're using and the techniques that they choose, they kind of have their go-to techniques, and you know, that's pretty much what they utilize. But Sabicas is different. He did so much different stuff. And it's really interesting as a guitarist. Of course, you can listen to his recordings and hear the amazing way that they sound and just be blown away by that. But then when you watch him play and you see the finger combinations that he's using, the different times that he chooses to utilize different techniques, It's really interesting and really fascinating. He did a ton of different types of things. And I feel like probably any great guitarist is going to experiment with this type of stuff when they practice, when they study, when they're working on techniques. But you really don't see a lot of guitarists utilize so many different types of things in performance. So what that kind of means to me is that Sabicas was a great experimenter. I mean, he taught himself all kinds of different things. I'm sure he picked some things up along the way, but this was before technology is the way that it is now, where you kind of just have this never-ending overflow of information and ability to see what other people are doing. So I just imagine him sitting in a room by himself, studying the guitar for hours and hours every day, and just being super interested in figuring out all these different ways to play, all these different ways to make sound and do different feats on the guitar. And I think that's just one of the most incredible things about him. So the first technical instance that I want to look at is his heavy utilization of the IA alternation technique. So here's a couple of little clips that demonstrate what I'm talking about. So it looks like this is all done free stroke, and he's simply alternating between A and I, and he's playing one finger together with the thumb. And I wasn't sure at first, but it looks like when you slow it down, it looks like, my guess is that the A finger is playing together with the thumb, and then the I finger is alternating in between. And it's also interesting here, you can see a couple things that we've already noticed in his other techniques. You can see the middle joint kind of shooting out away from the finger after the stroke, of course this being free stroke. And then you can see a much wider movement in his index finger. You can hardly see the A finger moving, but it's certainly not moving near as much as the rather big movement that the I finger does. In these couple of clips, I'm pretty sure that this is like classical guitar tremolo. 4-note tremolo instead of the traditional flamenco 5-note tremolo. Even this music that he wrote, to me, is one of his more classically influenced type of pieces. And this is the only instance where I remember seeing him do this type of technique. But it's so smooth at first, I thought it was like a 3-note tremolo. I thought it was like IA tremolo. But upon slowing it down and really listening, yeah, it looks like it's a 4-note traditional classical type tremolo. Here are some shots of him playing the flamenco 5-note tremolo. And what is interesting to me about this is, because my teacher thought Sabicas had the best sounding tremolo. And it is absolutely, one of the most even sounds that you'll ever hear. But the only thing I feel like I can recognize visually is that we've seen him in a few instances have these really big movements with his index finger. And when he does tremolo, those big movements are gone. And I think in these two shots, you can really see it. In this shot, you can see just a slight brief instance of the I finger, but it is pretty much in line with all the other fingers. And then in this shot, what I like, and sometimes I feel like this gives a lot of good information for a guitarist and what they're doing with their hand, is you can see a very clear shadow on his golpeador there. So in the shadow, you see mainly like the I and M fingers, and they have what looks like a very similar amount of movement. So of course in the flamenco 5-note tremolo, the I finger's pulling double duty, right? So maybe he doesn't have the time to make the wider range of stroke. But really interesting to see, this is a much more minimalistic type of movement approach that he utilizes in his 5-note tremolo. This is kind of a one-off thing that I saw him do. but he would have a lot of techniques like this where he would just use like in a piece or a few pieces. And at first I saw this and thought, yeah, I think I've seen that before, but then I took a closer look and I thought, no, I don't think I've ever actually seen this. So he's playing a melody in harmonics, and then he's doing these like little chord strummies as an accompaniment. So he's fretting the harmonics here, he's touching the string with his index finger, and then plucking the actual string with a thumb behind index. And then for the accompaniment, it looks like he is hitting what I think is two strings, maybe the first and second string together, with his A finger. And he's just very lightly strumming them, and it gives this really interesting type of effect. Because of course the melody is in the harmonics, so that's kind of a delicate balance you don't want to disrupt. And he has what is really an amazingly balanced accompaniment with these just kind of distant sounding strums that he achieves by just gently raking the first couple of strings with his A finger. This is something that I thought was kind of cool. I call it Rasqueado drifting. So what he'll do here, because I've never seen anybody else do this. I think I saw Pepe do it maybe, but I think when he was playing a Sabicas piece. So that would make sense. What he's doing here is he has a continuous Rasqueado pattern. I think this is something like up with P, down with A, down with I, something like that. So he'll do it over and over, and then he will move from the shoulder. You know, he takes that whole mechanism and moves the pattern from right to left. So he moves it from near the sound hole all the way to over the fingerboard and back. And it kind of gives this drifting type of effect, kind of going and coming back a bit to, I guess, vary up the sound when he's just doing the same pattern over and over. And then in this clip, he's doing the same thing, but he is using a different type of Rasqueado technique. So there's no thumb involved here. The thumb is sticking out like he's trying to hitch a ride. And it looks like it's maybe down with A, down with M, down with I, up with I type of technique. So he's taking that from behind the sound hole all the way to up the fingerboard. And this is interesting. As he gets further up the fingerboard, he starts to angle the technique a little bit differently. So he turns his hand, so his thumb kind of goes towards his head a little bit more, and he's definitely got a different angle. So kind of initially looks like, well, just a certain type of visual thing, but looks like he's definitely going for some very specific sounds here as he just tweaks that angle towards the end of moving that pattern up the fingerboard. And sticking with some Rasqueado just for another bit, this is the end of that zapateado that we talked about earlier that has the eye drag scale in it. And he does this really neat Rasqueado passage at the end. And I really analyzed this pattern and I'm not convinced. I think what it is he's just going down with the four fingers, down with little, down with A, down with M, down with I, in a continuous motion, but it's a group of 5. So we've seen great flamenco players do this before, where they are playing Rasqueado in a particular group, but they're not using a physical pattern that is the most literal representation of that group, but they're able to manipulate the sound so that it works just as well. It sounds just as great. So he's using a 4-stroke pattern, from what I can tell. If you think you see something differently, let me know. It looks like to me it's a 4-stroke pattern, but then it's in a kind of loose group of 5. It's not the tightest group of 5 that you'll ever hear, but it kind of has a helter-skelter type of, rolling down the hill finale type of feel to it at the end of the piece, and it sounds really great. But what really struck me about this is his different wrist approach. He kind of pulls his hand up some and his wrist is very flat. And then when he's doing the stroke, it looks like there is more middle joint involved, or it's more heavily relying on that and not as much on the throwing out of the fingers like from the big joint. And if you listen to this passage, it really sounds pretty delicate, especially at the beginning. And I think that's really, really neat. I've heard people play this piece and they just blast you through the back doors with this passage with their, really strong sounding Rasqueado, and that's not what he did. One of the most virtuosic things to me, and my teacher taught me this, is people's ability to know when to use something and when not to use something. Their ability to discern as artists, here's how much of this I need, and this is the perfect amount. Maybe I can do 2 or 3 or 4 times as much. Maybe I can play it 2 or 3 or 4 times faster. But this is what I need for this instance. So that's how this really spoke to me, was his rather delicate choice of the Rasqueado here. And then looking like he achieves that by flattening out the wrist, relying a little bit more on the middle joints to get that more delicate, really interesting type of sound. This Rasqueado pattern I think is really cool because I've never seen it before. So again, this is the end of a piece. So this is, the flamenco effect where it's like all hell is breaking loose. And it's going to get even rowdier than you thought possible during the rest of the piece. And he's doing a cool alternation of strumming here where he goes up down with I, followed by up down with M. And then depending on where he's putting the accents and executing the rhythm, sometimes he will do a couple of these strokes in a row before switching to the other finger, and then of course throwing in some big golpes along with that as well. But I just thought this was really neat and something I hadn't seen before. The shot from the front where, you can see him doing some patterns that involve all the fingers, but then in between that, I just noticed he's doing something different. He's not just going up and down with the same finger. He's actually alternating, going up and down with index followed by middle, in between, throwing in all his fingers for the ornamented strums. So I thought that was a really interesting and innovative type of pattern. The last technique is one of my favorites. This to me, I don't know if he got this from someone. As far as I know, he invented it. I've never really heard anybody else do something like this. But it's just such a cool effect, and it's multiple techniques happening back to back, one after the other, to create this really big, interesting sounding effect. So it starts with some really rapid triplet type arpeggios with AMI on the treble string. So he's got A finger on the first string, M finger on the second string, I finger on the third string, and he will do several, like maybe 4 or 5 or 6 iterations of that AMI pattern. And then on the last one, he will play the A finger and then he'll do a big drag across all 6 strings. So A finger drag from string 1 all the way through string 6. And then he ends it with this rapid alternating burst of several notes on the low 6th string. Now, in hearing him do this and knowing that his main scale technique was IM, I always thought that last burst was IM. But I was pretty amazed to find visually he does that last burst only on the 6th string with IA, which it really just blows my mind. There must have been something in particular that made that feel just right, because when he would play a scale, it would be IM. I really did not see him do an IA scale. Of course, we've seen him use IA, but not in scales. So I was pretty amazed to find that he ended with a rapid burst, several notes on the same string, and it was actually IA. But I think this is such a cool thing to do. I like to practice it and kind of mess around with it because it's several different techniques kind of blended together to make a really, really cool effect. And if you can get a handle on some of these things, it just seems like it would be really, really good for your guitar playing. You'd be able to do a lot of cool stuff with it. So I was certainly thrilled to find some instances of him doing this where we could see it and talk about it, and to really look at how he's utilizing it, what is exactly going on, because this is one of my favorite things that I would hear him do. Such a really creative thing and such a really cool use of 3 different techniques back to back. So that is all that we're going to talk about here. Thank you very much for watching this video and going through all these points with me. As always, I love when people chime in with their comments, sharing their personal experiences and their own insight into these great players and the amazing things that they can do on their instruments. Feel free to let me know if you have a request for someone that we can talk about in the future. I'm beginning to get more of these. I can't make any promises except to say I've really enjoyed making these videos. I think they're quite valuable for my own learning and for my own journey on the guitar and with music. So my plan is to keep making them for as long as I can. So if there's somebody that you'd like us to cover, by all means, let me know and I will definitely take it into account. I'll leave links around for you. You'll probably know where to find them. If you need to contact me about anything, if you want to find a playlist with more of these videos, if you want to check out some of my original compositions or other guitar work that I've done. You'll be able to find all that stuff in the description under this video. Thanks again for watching and have a wonderful day.